So our clients that see most success are the ones who don't treat it like a project, but treat it as an ongoing function of the business, revenue operations, and allocate resources internally, externally, whatever, to it. Those are typically the clients who see the most growth.
You're listening to RevOps Champions, a podcast created for B2B leaders to help you align your people, streamline your processes, trust your data, and leverage technology in order to grow your business. If you've been in the franchise world for a while, you've probably felt this. The brand's strong, the concept works, locations keep opening, and then something starts to slow down. It's not dramatic. It just starts to compound over time. That's the thing we're getting into today. Kristin's on because this is what she and the Denamico team see up close every day, working inside franchise networks, trying to figure out why growth that used to feel automatic suddenly doesn't. Kristin, you and the team actually just put this into a resource, right? The franchise growth playbook.
That's right. We did. It's everything we're going to talk about today, laid out for anyone who wants to go deeper after this conversation. So we'll include the link in the notes, but let's start the conversation.
Awesome. Let's do it. So what actually happens to a franchise network once it crosses that 100 location mark?
So the premise of what we've seen after speaking to many people, both advisors to franchisors as well as the franchisors and franchisees themselves, everyone creates playbooks for where they're at today and where they're trying to get to. But at certain stages, and there's common stages of where this typically happens, that last framework doesn't work anymore, that last playbook, and the playbook needs to be rewritten. And certainly when you're trying to scale a franchisor beyond that 75, 100 unit location, the infrastructure that enabled you to get there isn't typically enough to get you beyond the 100 unit locations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, we talk about stalling in 4 specific places. What are they?
Yeah. So the 4 specific areas are visibility. So often we hear the expression, we're flying blind, because the people who need to know in order to see data, to see what's not working. And often you're getting those data too late. So it's like lagging indicators as opposed to using leading indicators. So you're often flying blind for too long in order to react fast enough to make changes that will be impactful. Another piece is attribution. Most systems today, everyone's tracking the spend, but then what does that spend lead to? What kind of outcomes? That part, it gets harder and harder, often because the lead journey or the customer journey is not linear. There's multi touches and things like that. So that gets harder. But of course, the more you're spending, the more important it is to know what that attribution is. The third piece here is intelligence. And again, as you're scaling up and getting to that 75, 100 plus units, the questions that boards and investors ask are often more nuanced than what just a single source report can tell you. So that if that data to tell that story doesn't have all the context and the information in one system, it just requires a more sophisticated system to be able to tell you all of that and answer those more difficult questions. And then finally, on the development side, so we've heard from a lot of multi-unit, more sophisticated franchisee owners that they're looking deeper into what a franchise brand can offer them besides just what you're looking for in terms of a business for yourself as a single unit operator as opposed to multi-unit operator is a little bit different. And the more sophisticated multi-unit operators value a system and the technology and the infrastructure that's going to enable them to be successful more easily.
Okay, so you touched on the 4 areas of visibility, attribution, intelligence, and development.
Right.
So which of those 4 do you run into most in a first conversation with a new client?
I think it really depends on what's happening with that brand and where they're at when we first talk to them. So probably of the visibility and the flying blind, I think that's kind of applies to most franchisors in most cases. There's very few franchisors that have their entire operation on a platform where they can see end to end when a franchisee candidate comes into the pipeline, like a potential franchisee, as through to that franchisee being onboarded and them running their business over a number of years so that they can then find, and this is where AI is going to be amazing in the franchise space, is to help
Mhm.
find these patterns so we can be more predictive on what does it take for the most successful franchisees. What's the pattern of what made that happen? And that's where we get into this franchise intelligence as well, is to being able to use leading indicators and be more predictive of if we do this and this and this, or if the franchisee does this and this, or if the franchisee has this background. Those are the things that are going to ultimately help this franchisee be more successful. So I think that's really exciting. But the visibility is, I would say, one of the reasons we love HubSpot is you can build that end-to-end platform for the entire revenue operations of the whole system on one piece of software, which is HubSpot. But the other thing I think most commonly as franchise brands are scaling, probably the one that is one of the earlier places where they need help is the franchise development piece. Because if they're investing in ad spend and brokers and things like that, that's a significant investment. So
Mhm.
understanding what is the sales cycle, what's the cost of franchisee acquisition, that sort of thing is
Mhm.
important to track.
Right. And then these four things all lead and, or I guess, led to what we're now at Denamico calling franchise performance intelligence. For the people who haven't heard that term before, what does franchise performance intelligence actually mean?
It's a lot of what I was just speaking about. It's having the right architecture. So your data model, how your system is architected to make sure you're capturing the right information so that you can see the patterns, that you can get the leading indicators, and you can track this end to end performance. And it's not a big brother track, like we want to make sure a franchisee is doing the right steps and things like that. It's a how do we use that franchise, this intelligence to help enable franchisees to be more successful because we are proactively able to coach them knowing the patterns we know that will lead to success.
Yeah. Yeah. What does that architecture actually require? What's underneath the architecture?
Yeah, I would say it's that single source of truth that's tracking, as I mentioned earlier. If we can see the whole life cycle of a franchisee from the time they
Mhm.
apply to be a franchisee through to they've been now operating as a franchisee with one or more units for X period of time, and we can see that whole life cycle in one system, that gives us data and context that is so helpful to be able to do this, figure out what the performance, figure out the performance intelligence piece, and then really engineer performance.
Yeah. Which, of course, we want that, right?
Right.
So then, Kristen, to tell us, what is the real difference between a network with this in place and one without it?
I think you've spoken on the podcast on RevOps Champions with numerous experts in the franchise space that it's talked about, knowing systems are going to break. And we know that as you grow, it's different problems at different stages. So, given that, there's different challenges depending on where you're at in your level of growth, having a system where we've got the whole life cycle stage of a franchisee and it's all connected and we have a single source of truth. I think that enables us to identify problems before they happen. Even if we haven't predicted that they're going to happen through a leading indicator, we're going to know about it much sooner to react faster before it's like a full turnaround type of effort required.
Mhm.
It helps us to be far more proactive in marketing spend because we know what's working. We have benchmarks. We can deploy resources in the most impactful, positively impactful way. So, and, often in any business, franchise or otherwise, um, even a non-franchise business, in the initial stages is really about figuring out what works. Scaling is being able to grow exponentially without having to rebuild things. And so creating that infrastructure, which doesn't make sense to create necessarily at 5 units or even 25 units, But once you've figured out what works for the large part, and then you get to 7,500 and you're really trying to scale, that's where you really cannot do that without having the right infrastructure in place. Because you can't systemize things because you need people involved, judgment involved. You just haven't created the systems yet. So if you truly want to scale, the infrastructure, having that in place makes it a lot easier and a lot less stressful.
Right. And then, of course, I mean, these situations and so as these brands grow through these different inflection points, it looks different depending on the leadership seat that each person has.
Mhm.
So does this gap show up the same way for everyone, or does it depend on the role?
It definitely depends on the role. As an example, a COO might manage by exception instead of by design. CEOs are typically answering to board and investors, and it probably is going to take time for them to find those answers if they don't have the system set up and know what actually having this performance intelligence piece. With the CMOs, there's the challenge, I think, is understanding what happens to leads that are generated at the franchisor level once they go to a franchisee, being able to track that all the way through, which is another reason of having the benefit of having the entire network on one platform, one software platform. And the VPA of development or the whole franchise development team, the questions that they get in the early stages of selling franchises, as opposed to later when they're selling to like potentially multi-unit franchisees, they're different buyers and they're going to have a different level of understanding and level of sophistication typically.
Yeah. Yeah. And then is there a role that feels this pain first, even if they're not the one who signs off on fixing it?
Well, like I said, I think the visibility piece is we see that across most franchisors, but as this brand is scaling, I think where they're often investing the most resources, which is why it's the first place to come up, is probably in the fran dev function.
Yeah. So if someone listening is nodding along right now, like where do they actually start?
Yeah. So we've got a great short assessment with this guide that anyone can take for free to just get them started and give them, a little bit more visibility into things to think about and where they might get started.
Right.
One other key point about that is we really believe, well, I mean, strongly believe it's a core principle of how we think about this is having this end to end of the franchisee life cycle. That's really your revenue operations system. It's where you generate revenue through sales, marketing, service, the FBCs, coaching the franchisees. All of that is really part of your revenue operations system. And often, because there's technology linked to this to enable it, people think of this as an implementation and it's a project. We need to get this system, implemented, get everybody on it. But then it's not regarded as this living, breathing system that should have continuous improvement and be continuously optimized. So our clients that see most success are the ones who don't treat it like a project, but treat it as an ongoing function of the business, revenue operations, and allocate resources internally, externally, whatever to it. Those are typically the clients who see the most growth.
And then, Kristen, are there any like real results that you can point to?
Yeah, so one of our franchisor clients, it's a multi-brand holding company with over 800 locations. They saved over 1,000 hours a year and were able to get rid of 10 plus spreadsheets that were a real manual effort to maintain. Another client, this was actually a large regional franchisee. They added a lot of automation to their sales process and saved 1,800 hours a year. And that's at the franchisee level with over 90% of user adoption. So it's real results that go to the bottom line.
Yeah.
Not to mention what those benefits do in terms of like a customer experience as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, Kristen, this is exactly why we wanted to bring you on. This isn't theory. It's what, we're watching happen inside real networks right now.
Right. So if any of this hits close to home to anyone listening, So the playbook, like we said, is on our website and it walks through all of these points where franchise networks typically stall in more depth. And then that quick assessment is included and you can see where your own network stands. So it's a free download and it's in the show notes also.
Awesome. Yeah. So go and grab that franchise growth playbook. Kristin, thanks. Thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure.